Gilded Age Part 3. So last lecture we discussed the different things with production. We discussed how things were made. We discussed the important people of production. Today we're going to get into what really drives production, and those are the workers. You know, what we didn't mention in the last lecture is that the people are the fuel of this. You know, you can talk about coal, you can talk about steam, but without people, none of this works. You can have all these ideas, but none of this works. And unfortunately, many times, especially in those big factories, that's the forgotten piece here. Okay, the factories allowed for those mass production, but it also created problems because workers are going to be the fuel of that, and workers burn out. Okay, a lot of workers get bored because their jobs were extremely repetitive. Imagine pushing a button or pulling a lever for 12 hours a day. It gets pretty repetitive. And long, dangerous hours, long, dangerous work with very little pay is going to lead to a lot of problems, and people are going to basically get sick and tired of it. Okay? In 1870, the average workday was 12 hours. So that's half a day. And then let's just say on average you sleep 8 to 7 hours, so you have 4 to 5 hours to yourself, and that's probably being pretty generous. Men made about 10 cents an hour and basically $6 a week, $6 a week. Women would make half of that, $3.50 a week. Children, 50 cents a week. And the idea of children working, that was just part of it. Children were expected to work, and you got to remember back in the time in the 1870s, late 1800s, people were just off the farm. And the idea of having big families was still very common, even in the cities, because in the farm you were expected to work as with your family. That's why they had big families. And then they moved to the cities, and the same thing is expected. So, the problems here are going to be pretty obvious. Low wages, long hours, workers' safety and compensation. Factories were dangerous places to work, and many times if you got hurt and you couldn't work, then you were fired and let go, and they brought in somebody healthier, especially during the time of the immigrants coming in the late 1800s, early 1900s. The idea of getting hurt and being taken care of by your company, that wasn't there yet. Okay, but we're going to see that. The manager system, okay, the lack of personal contact by the owners. The owners were separated from the workers, so it was very easy for the owners to say, yeah, we need to bump up production. But they're not seeing how their workers are suffering in those situations. So it was really easy to become detached from the process because a manager would be taking care of the factories. And many managers just went along with what the owner said because they wanted to keep their job and didn't report the struggles of the workers. And of course, and we can say this throughout any time period, the unequal distribution of wealth. Disparity grew between the wealthy and the others. People wanted to get paid. They're seeing all these other guys get rich off of their hard labor. So people wanted to get paid better for their work. So we're going to start to see this conflict arise, and we'll start to see the birth of labor unions in the United States. Labor unions is basically a way to organize your workers together so they can have one voice to the owners, and they can go up and complain or hopefully get some help in different manners with the problems that we discussed. Otherwise, one guy goes up and says, hey, I'd like to get paid more. I'm working too hard. I need to get paid more. Well, sorry, thank you, you're fired. We'll just get somebody else. But if the whole group comes in, that's a different story. And that's where the labor unions will be formed. The first one is called the National Labor Union, created by William Silvis. It was not effective. It didn't last. However, it did show the individual worker that they had to band together to get any of their demands met. Okay, I mean, that's basically the importance. One person is not going to be able to get this done. They're going to have to unite. So we see the next one. It's called the Knights of Labor, and this was by Uriah Stevens. This became more and more popular just because it welcomed everybody. It welcomed African Americans, it welcomed women, it welcomed immigrants, mostly made up of unskilled workers. It frowned on strikes, but a unionship would represent their membership, and they began to bargain collectively, meaning not one person would get a raise. We all get a raise or we get nothing. That's called collective bargaining. We all work together to get the same thing. And it's good and bad. Back during these times, I think these unions were much, much needed. Now we see, you hear, depending on your own opinion, whether unions are needed or not. You guys have to decide that for yourself. But back then, I think it was unmistakable that some of these unions were needed. They strive for an 8-hour workday, and if you look up here on the screen, 8 hours of labor, 8 hours of recreation, 8 hours of rest. So it became a pretty popular event until a disaster. It's called the Haymarket Square, also called the Chicago Riot. Okay, and basically it took place, you can guess, in Chicago, and where hay was sold, hence Haymarket Square. And they were basically meeting to discuss, they had a rally, an 8-hour workday. And it became violent. Okay, there was a police presence there. People were upset over some violence that occurred before. Somebody threw a bomb at the police. 7 people would end up being killed. The police then reacted with their own violence, and hundreds would be hurt. They opened fire, and the union gets blamed for this. Even though it might have been just a few people that were out of control, but the union gets blamed. So public opinion changes for these unions, and they're seen as violent things. So we really see the unions take a hit because of the Haymarket Square. It started as a peaceful riot, but you know how those things work out. So public opinion changes. Now, another example in the 1870s, another violent example, they're called the Molly Maguires. Okay, these are coal miners in Pennsylvania. Call themselves the vigilante coal miners. Basically, they'll take matters in their own hands. Okay, if nobody's listening to them, they will use violence and intimidation to get what they want. And here is they call this a coffin note. Back in the day, this is how they would write, okay? And you can see the drawings of the guns. There's a drawing of a coffin. You could see their English wasn't exactly the greatest. This is your house. Notice you have carried this as far as you can by cheating the men. You 3 bosses, be careful. If the above don't be your house in a short time. From a stranger, he knows you. So you can see the English is a little off there. But they will threaten their owners to get their demands met. And eventually they'll all be rounded up, and 11 of them will be hung for their crimes. So another violent approach to this. And you'll see this is a theme that we will see throughout this time period. 1886, the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, led by Samuel Gompers. There's a picture of Gompers. And it was a craft union. Okay, they were organized by their crafts. For instance, you'd have an electrician union, bricklayers, concrete. Today, many things like that. So it becomes a craft union. Now they're different. They will encourage strikes, and if you're a member of the AFL, it will eventually become very, very powerful. You can put the steel workers in there and things like that. So they organized into crafts, okay? And they'll actually become more and more powerful. And AFL is still around today. Another example of violence. In 1892, this is Carnegie. Okay, this is called the Homestead Strike. The Homestead Strike basically began. Carnegie was a pretty shrewd businessman, but when it came down to conflict and things like that, he really just wasn't good at that kind of thing. So he hired this gentleman. This man's name was Henry Frick. Henry Frick. Henry Frick was a ruthless businessman, absolutely ruthless. He did not care. He was a millionaire himself, nowhere near what Carnegie was, but he was a millionaire himself. So what you see in business practices many times is a man will hire someone for a job that he may or may not be good at. For instance, the ruthless side of business. So Carnegie hires Frick to manage the businesses. They build a new steel mill in Pittsburgh. So Frick is going to oversee this, and he was ruthless, cutting the fat around the business, which meant letting people go, firing people, hiring new, cheaper labor, things like that. Stuff that Carnegie didn't have the stomach for. So Frick was very well known for his anti-union position, and he was going to be the man negotiating with this union. And in fact, at one point, he literally will lock out the workers in the steel mill and will start to hire what we call scabs, people that will work that aren't affiliated with the union. The steel workers will then actually barricade themselves inside the steel mill to prevent these scabs coming in. It just gets crazy. It gets ugly. So Frick, all this is happening while Carnegie is in Scotland enjoying his land. He's actually building a castle in Scotland. And partly because he didn't want to be around for this. So Frick hires a group called the Pinkertons. The Pinkertons National Detective Agency. We never sleep. We're watching you. Basically, they're thugs. Okay? And their job is to go in and break the strike. Long story short, violence breaks out. The sides open fire. 3 of the Pinkertons were killed and 7 steelworkers were killed. And it all happened just because of work. I mean, the idea of people losing their life over work is a scary process. But that's exactly what happened. You can imagine Frick will eventually be chased out of Pittsburgh. Carnegie takes a huge hit with his business and his reputation. It's also no surprise that he starts to invest in or donate a lot of money to kind of rebuild his image. But those are some of the things that were going on. Another example is called the Pullman Strike. Okay, the Pullman Company was a railroad company owned by George Pullman. They actually manufactured railroad cars. And by 1894, it operated a first-class sleeping cars that everybody knew about. It was a household name. And we don't talk much about railroads because we don't use railroads like they did back then. But back then, Pullman was a household name, very popular company. He owned a company outside of Chicago and built these towns that housed the workers for the company. Okay, he liked to promote the companies as these top-class towns with very little problems. However, if you ask some of the workers, they're going to change. They're going to have a different opinion because the company owned these towns. So the people are working for the company, they get paid, and then they got to pay rent to the company again. So it's like the company is basically getting their money all over again. The workers were not very happy. Okay, when a depression hit in 1893, Pullman decides to cut his workforce and lower their pay by 25%. That didn't go over very well. So the railroad workers decide to strike, and they will actually refuse to pull any trains that had Pullman cars on them. The problem is what is being used to move the U.S. mail at that time, and that is a government thing that cannot be stopped. by law. So the Pullman cars had mail on them. And so the government is going to be sent in to end this strike. And literally the Army, and if you look at this picture, you'll see what I'm saying. Here's the Army. They got their guns out going through this period. Here's a picture of George Pullman himself. So the government comes in to save Pullman basically because of the mail issue. But once again, it looks terrible, okay? So the government is siding with big business and basically stepping on the workers. And we will see that for quite some time.